On the surface, Essex, Maryland, is the kind of place where people don't expect headline-making crime. It's a working-class community just east of Baltimore, where the Patapsco River curves along its edge and where row houses and small apartment buildings sit quietly alongside corner diners, auto shops, and taverns that have been family-run for decades. By the mid-2000s, Essex had its share of drug problems, domestic disputes, and the occasional violent crime, but most residents thought of it as an ordinary suburb. The rhythms of daily life were predictable. Children went to school, factory workers and office clerks commuted into the city, and police patrols circled neighborhoods to keep drunk drivers and reckless kids in check. But on one chilly night, what began as one of those routine patrols would unravel into something shocking, disturbing, and unforgettable. A single traffic stop, carried out almost by habit, revealed a horror that Baltimore County officers could not have imagined. A suitcase in the trunk of a car that turned a minor violation into a homicide investigation that would ripple through the county for years. It was just after 11 p.m. when Officer Daniels of the Baltimore County Police Department pulled onto Eastern Boulevard, one of Essex's busiest stretches of roadway. The bars along the strip were beginning to close, releasing small crowds of patrons into the cold night air. The neon glow of bar signs and fast food restaurants painted the asphalt in streaks of color. Traffic was steady but not heavy. Daniels had been on the force for nearly a decade. He'd seen plenty of late-night drunks weaving through traffic, plenty of drivers with broken taillights or expired tags. He didn't expect anything more than paperwork and maybe a quick tow. His patrol car hummed steadily along the road as he scanned vehicles. That's when he noticed the sedan. It was a dark-colored older model with scratches on its rear bumper and mismatched hubcaps. At first, it was the slight swerve between lanes that caught his attention. The car wasn't speeding, but it drifted left and right in a way that suggested the driver might be impaired. Then Daniels noticed the tags. Something about the license plate seemed off. The sticker looked faded and out of date, maybe even switched. To him, it was enough for probable cause. He flicked on his overhead lights. The red and blue glow flashed across the quiet street, reflecting in the diner windows and catching the attention of a few pedestrians heading home. The sedan slowed awkwardly, signaling late, before pulling onto the shoulder. Daniels called in the stop, reading off the plate number. Approaching a car is one of the most dangerous parts of an officer's job. Daniels adjusted his flashlight, resting one hand on his holster, and walked to the driver's side. Inside were two young men. The driver looked barely in his 20s, with a thin frame, baggy sweatshirt, and wide eyes that darted nervously between the rearview mirror and the officer standing outside. The passenger, slightly older, wore a ball cap pulled low. His gaze was fixed on the floor, refusing eye contact. Daniels greeted them calmly and asked for license and registration. The driver's hands shook as he fumbled through the glove compartment. His voice cracked when he spoke, and the registration he handed over didn't quite match the name he gave. Daniels knew nervous drivers weren't unusual. Plenty of people panicked around police. But the tension in that car felt different, heavier. The passenger whispered something to the driver under his breath. Daniels couldn't make out the words, but he noticed the driver's knuckles turn white as he gripped the wheel. At that moment, Daniels made a quick decision. He called for backup. Within minutes, another patrol car pulled up behind the sedan. Officers James and Keller stepped out, approaching the passenger side. With backup present, Daniels asked the men to step out of the car. They hesitated, glancing at each other, before slowly climbing out. Both stood stiffly on the cold asphalt, their breaths visible in the night air. While one officer kept an eye on the suspects, Daniels began to search the vehicle. He started with the obvious places: glove box, door compartments, under the seats. He found nothing more suspicious than a half-empty soda bottle and a crumpled fast food bag. The interior smelled faintly of cologne, as if someone had tried to cover up another odor. Then he moved to the back seat. Nothing. A quick sweep with the flashlight showed a few stray receipts and some dirt on the floor mats, but nothing alarming. Finally, Daniels reached for the trunk release. The driver shifted uneasily. "You don't need to check back there," he said quickly, his voice rising an octave. "It's just clothes, man." That was all Daniels needed to hear. He popped the trunk. Inside the trunk sat a large black suitcase, bulky and oddly positioned, as if it had been shoved in hastily. At first glance, it looked like luggage someone might take on a long trip. But its presence in this old, beat-up sedan raised questions. Daniels leaned closer, shining his flashlight over the zipper. The suitcase wasn't fully closed. A small gap exposed what looked like fabric pressed tightly against the opening. Daniels knelt, tugged the zipper slowly, and pulled it back several inches. What he saw made his stomach drop. Inside the suitcase was the unmistakable sight of human skin. Pale, lifeless, pressed against the lining of the bag. The body of a young woman was crammed inside, her limbs bound with tape. Bruises marked her face, and her hair was matted against her cheek. Daniels froze. For a split second, the world went silent. Then training took over. He shouted for the other officers, slammed the trunk closed, and called in for homicide detectives. "We've got a body." Repeat, "We've got a body in the trunk." The suspects' faces went blank. The driver muttered incoherently, insisting he didn't know anything. The passenger hung his head, refusing to look up. Both were slammed in cuffs and shoved into separate squad cars. The casual stop had just transformed into a crime scene. Within minutes, the quiet stretch of Eastern Boulevard was swarming with police cars. Yellow tape was strung across the road. Curious neighbors stepped outside in pajamas and coats, whispering to each other as they craned for a view. A few even pulled out early-model cell phones to snap grainy photos. Word spread quickly. They found a body in a suitcase. Forensic vans arrived. Detectives climbed out in long coats, carrying evidence kits. Officers with cameras snapped photos of the trunk, the suitcase, the car's interior. Every inch of the vehicle became potential evidence. The body in the suitcase was handled with care, the bag lifted from the trunk and placed in the back of the van. Even hardened detectives admitted later that it was one of the most disturbing things they had seen, a human being stuffed away like luggage. The suspects sat separately in squad cars, staring blankly ahead. Neither spoke. To onlookers, they didn't look like hardened killers, just scared, ordinary young men caught in something horrific. But appearances meant little now. By the time dawn broke, the story had already reached Baltimore's local news outlets. Reporters scrambled to confirm details. Television anchors repeated the phrase, "body found in suitcase," with a mix of disbelief and sensationalism. For Essex residents, fear set in. Who was the victim? How had she ended up in the trunk of a car pulled over for swerving? Was this a random act of violence or something more calculated? Parents warned their daughters to be careful. Conversations in diners and gas stations centered on the horrifying stop. For Officer Daniels and the others who opened that trunk, the image was seared into memory. The weight of what they'd found pressed on them, not just the horror of the discovery, but the realization of how close the suspects had been to getting away. Had they not been pulled over for swerving, the suitcase might never have been found. The woman might have vanished without a trace. In a matter of minutes, what began as a traffic stop became a homicide investigation. A body stuffed in a suitcase. 2 men in custody. A quiet community shaken to its core. The nightmare in Essex, Maryland, was only just beginning. The next phase, the investigation, the identification of the victim, and the unraveling of the suspect's story, would reveal even darker truths about how a young woman's life ended and how fate, and a single police decision to flip on sirens, brought the crime to light. The moment the trunk was closed and the suspects were cuffed, the case moved from the hands of patrol officers to the homicide unit. The body in the suitcase was no longer just a shocking discovery at a traffic stop. It was now evidence in a murder that demanded answers. Detectives from Baltimore County arrived within the hour, pulling on latex gloves as they surveyed the scene. Flashbulbs from police cameras illuminated the car, capturing every angle, every fingerprint, every stain that might later tell a story. The suitcase itself was treated like a fragile crime scene within a crime scene. It was lifted carefully from the trunk and placed into a van destined for the medical examiner's office. Even officers with years on the job found themselves shaken. The image of a young woman bound and stuffed into luggage wasn't something easily erased. Some stood in silence, staring at the closed trunk, their minds racing with questions that couldn't yet be answered. The suspects sat in separate police cruisers, their faces pale and blank. One stared at the ground, lips moving as if whispering a prayer. The other avoided eye contact with everyone, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Neither offered an explanation. Neither asked about the woman. They seemed frozen, caught in the weight of what had just been exposed. At headquarters, The two men were processed and booked. Their fingerprints were taken, mugshots snapped under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. They were placed in different interrogation rooms, bare spaces with metal chairs and a table bolted to the floor. Detectives entered with files, tape recorders, and calm but probing voices. The younger suspect insisted he didn't know what was in the trunk. He claimed they had borrowed the car, that the suitcase wasn't his, that they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the cracks in his story were immediate. If the car wasn't his, why had he fumbled so nervously with the registration? Why had his prints been found on the suitcase? Why did surveillance footage already place him with the victim earlier that day? His voice shook as he tried to explain, his words stumbling over themselves until they collapsed into silence. The older suspect took a different route. He claimed no memory of the woman at all. He said they were just out driving, that whatever was in the trunk had nothing to do with him. But detectives had already found fibers from the victim's clothing in the back seat of the car, fibers that matched the area where he had been sitting. He too fell quiet as the hours passed, realizing denial could only go so far against evidence that grew heavier with every lab report. Meanwhile, at the office of the chief medical examiner, the grim work of identification began. The woman was removed from the suitcase with care, her body examined in the sterile, clinical light of the autopsy room. Bruises marked her arms and legs, signs that she had been restrained. Her cause of death was quickly established as blunt force trauma to the head. She had been alive only hours before the traffic stop. For investigators, this meant they had caught the suspects in the immediate aftermath of the crime, perhaps even before they had finalized a plan to dispose of the body permanently. Her name was released within 24 hours. She was a young woman in her 20s, recently reported missing by her family. Friends described her as kind-hearted, ambitious, someone who had her life ahead of her. Her sudden disappearance had already caused panic among her loved ones, but no one could have imagined the horror of how she was found. When news broke that her body had been discovered in a suitcase in Essex, grief turned to shock, and shock turned to outrage. Vigils were held. Candles burned on street corners. Posters with her smiling face, once symbols of hope she might be found alive, now stood as memorials. The media seized on the story with relentless energy. Headlines screamed across Baltimore, "Body in suitcase stuns county police." News anchors spoke with urgency, their voices tinged with disbelief. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse and the suspect's arraignment, cameras pointed at every officer and lawyer who walked by. The quiet suburb of Essex had become the center of a story that felt ripped from a crime drama, except this time it was real. Detectives pieced together the victim's final hours. Witnesses recalled seeing her with the suspects earlier that evening at a shopping center. Security footage confirmed she entered their car willingly, suggesting she knew them at least casually. From there, the timeline grew dark. What exactly happened inside that car, whether a robbery gone wrong, a dispute that escalated, or a planned attack, remained uncertain. But what was undeniable was that she never came out alive. The case built steadily. Forensic teams matched the suspect's fingerprints to the suitcase. DNA evidence placed them in direct contact with the victim. The registration papers they tried to present were falsified. Piece by piece, the puzzle formed a chilling picture. The men had taken the victim, killed her, and attempted to conceal her body in the most shocking way possible. Their swerving on the road, a simple mistake, had led police directly to them.